Tonight logs on the Firth of Clyde, 1263. The Norse fleet anchored at Logs and the last days of Viking Scotland. This is Tartan Lullaby, sleep history from Scotland. The sky above the Cumbraes is still dark. A thin line of grey sits low over the water to the east, where the hills of Renfrewshire catch the first suggestion of light. The Firth of Clyde is quiet at this hour. The tide is moving, but gently, and the surface of the water holds a flat, pewter colour that is neither night nor morning. The shore at Logs runs roughly north to south along a shallow bay. The beach is coarse here, a mix of grey sand and small stones that shifts with each season. Above the waterline, the ground rises in gentle terraces before the land climbs more steeply toward the ridge of hills that runs inland. Those hills are covered in rough grass and heather, dark and featureless in the pre-dawn. The nearest high ground to the southeast is Knock Hill, its rounded summit blending into the general darkness of the ridge. There is a burn that comes down from those hills and crosses the lower ground before reaching the shore. In 1263, that burn is not yet channeled or managed in any formal way. It runs where it chooses across the flatter coastal strip, finding a path through soft ground and reed beds before it loses itself in the beach gravel. The sound of it is constant, a low murmur underneath everything else. At this hour, it is one of the few sounds that carries. The settlement at Logs is small. It sits on the coastal strip between the water and the rising ground behind. There is no town in any formal sense. There are clusters of buildings, some of timber, some of stone, with thatched roofs that hold the damp of the autumn nights. The buildings are low and dark. No lights show yet from within them. The smoke from the previous evening's fires has long since gone cold, and the morning air is clean and sharp with salt. September in this part of Ayrshire carries a particular quality. The summer warmth is gone, but the frosts have not yet come. The air off the water is cool and heavy. It tastes of salt and wet rock, and the faint, organic smell of wrack and kelp that has come up on the previous tide and now lies along the high-water mark in dark, irregular lines. Walking the shore in this hour, you would smell the weed before you saw it. The kelp beds extend well out from the shore at Logs. In daylight, they are visible as dark patches in the shallower water, lifting slightly with the swell. The bottom of the bay is rocky in places and sandy in others. The fishermen who work from this shore know its character in detail. They know where the ground is clean and where it is foul, where the current sets strongly on a flood tide, and where a boat can sit in still water even when the wind is up. Those boats are pulled above the tideline now. They are small craft built for inshore work along this stretch of coast. Their hulls are clinker-built, with overlapping strakes of oak fixed with iron rivets. They sit on their keels in the darkness, angled slightly, their masts unstepped and lying fore and aft along the thwarts. The oars are pulled inboard or laid under the thwarts out of the way. The smell of pine tar from their caulked seams mixes with the salt air. Fishing is the primary occupation along this shore. The Firth of Clyde in this period is extraordinarily productive. Herring come into the inner Firth in great shoals during the autumn months. They move close to the surface on calm nights and can be taken with drift nets paid out from a slowly moving boat. Haddock and cod are taken on long lines, baited hooks set on the bottom, and hauled the following morning. Sprats come inshore in huge quantities in October and November. The timing of the fish is known and reliable. Men here have worked these rhythms for generations. The nets from the previous day's work are hanging on poles and frames above the shore. They are made of twisted hemp cord, rough to the touch and heavy when wet. Each net has small stone weights knotted along its foot rope and small floats of cork or wood along its head rope. Where the knots have loosened in use, or where a strand has chafed through against a gunwale, the nets need repair. That work will begin this morning when the light comes. It is slow, careful work done with a wooden needle and a supply of spare cord kept in a basket. Beyond the fishing boats and the net poles, the ground rises slightly. Here the buildings begin. The main structure in any settlement of this kind is not a house, but a hall. At Largs there is a hall of some description associated with the local landowning interest. In 1263, this stretch of Ayrshire coast is within the sphere of the Scottish Crown and its local representatives. The precise form of the hall at Largs in this period is not fully recoverable, but a structure of some weight and permanence is certain. Stone walls, probably a single story in height, with a thatched or possibly turf roof. A central hearth, sleeping space and working space not clearly divided from one another. Around and below the hall, the other buildings cluster without any formal plan. Some are byres for cattle. Some are storage buildings for grain or for the equipment associated with fishing. Some are the houses of farming families. The distinction between a house and a byre is not always clear in buildings of this type. Animals and people share warmth through the winter, and a building designed for one purpose in summer may serve another in the cold months. The livestock are quiet now in the last of the darkness. A few cattle stand together in a field to the north of the main buildings. There are sheep on the hillside above, invisible in the dark, but occasionally audible as a movement, a shift of hooves on wet grass. Pigs are kept closer to the buildings. They are contained rather than pennied, moved between patches of ground, depending on what needs rooting and clearing. They are a constant, low-level presence in any settlement of this kind. The fields around Largs in 1263 are small and irregular. The land nearest the shore has been cleared and cultivated, but the clearance has been incomplete. Patches of scrub alder and willow occupy the wetter ground where the drainage is poor. The cultivated strips are separated by uneven banks of earth and stone. The grain harvest has been brought in by now. September is late for that work, but the crop will be in the barn or the stack. The fields are stubble. In the darkness, they are a dull, pale surface lying flat between the banks and the patches of rougher ground. Oats are the main grain crop in this part of Scotland in this period. They are ground at a hand quern or taken to whatever mill serves the local community. Barley is also grown, a hardier variety suited to the climate. The bread made from oatmeal is flat and dense, cooked on a flat stone over the fire. The brewing of ale from barley is a domestic activity, done in quantity and consumed regularly. Water from the burn is safe enough in normal conditions, but ale is safer in terms of the illnesses that come with contaminated water, and it carries calories that matter in a working life. The diet on this shore is heavily based on fish. Herring is the staple. It is eaten fresh in season, which is now in these autumn weeks. It is also preserved by salting and by drying. The salted fish are packed in barrels or in stone-lined pits and will keep through the winter. Dried fish are strung on lines or stored flat. The smell of fish preservation is a constant background to life in a settlement like this one. It is so familiar to the people who live here that they do not notice it. A stranger arriving from inland would notice it immediately. Root vegetables and greens supplement the grain and the fish. Turnips, onions, and wild greens gathered from the surrounding land. Hazelnuts from the scrubby woodland on the hillsides. In season, berries, milk and cheese from the cattle, though milk production falls sharply in autumn as the pasture deteriorates. Beef is eaten, but not casually. Cattle are valuable as working and dairy animals, and slaughter is a deliberate decision, usually linked to the onset of winter when feeding animals through until spring becomes difficult. The light is changing now, very slowly. The grey line over the Renfrewshire hills has widened. The surface of the Firth is distinguishable from the sky. The Cumbraes are taking on a low, dark shape against the lighter water beyond. Great Cumbrae lies roughly 2 miles off the Largs shore, and at this hour it is a solid mass sitting in the pale channel. The water between the island and the shore is visible as a strip of grey movement. There are boats on that water, not local fishing craft, but something very different. The Norse fleet has been anchored in the Firth for some days. It came down from the north, from Orkney and the Norse-held Western Isles under King Hakon of Norway. The fleet is large. Contemporary accounts place the number of ships in the hundreds, though the precise figure is uncertain. What is certain is that the anchorage around the Cumbraes holds a significant concentration of Norse longships and supply vessels. Their presence has been known and watched for weeks. Those ships are dark shapes on the water now. Their high prows are just visible as vertical lines against the pale sky. They sit at anchor in the channel and in the sheltered water to the south of Great Cumbrae. On board them, men are sleeping or waking in conditions that are cramped and cold. A longship is not designed for comfort at anchor. The men sleep on their sea chests or under their shields or wrapped in their cloaks on the deck planking. The ships have been at sea since late summer, and the crew are tired and beginning to feel the autumn weather. The autumn weather in the Firth of Clyde can change quickly. The prevailing wind here comes from the southwest, funneled by the shape of the land and the water. When it comes in force, the Firth becomes dangerous for ships at anchor on a lee shore. The shore at Largs is precisely that. A hard southwesterly would drive anything anchored in the channel toward the beach. That is a fact known to every sailor who has worked this water. The wind this morning is light. From the shore it would be felt as a gentle movement of air from the west, carrying the salt smell of the open firth. But the sky to the southwest, if the light was strong enough to read it, shows cloud building over Arran. Arran is roughly 15 miles to the southwest. Its mountain spine is not visible yet in the pre-dawn, but it will appear when the light comes, a dark, jagged line rising above the horizon. On the shore at Largs, the first people are beginning to move. A door opens in one of the low buildings. There is the brief glow of a rekindled fire inside, visible for a moment before the door closes again. The sound of a dog somewhere to the north of the main cluster of buildings. The movement of the cattle in their field as they shift and begin to graze in the growing light. A fisherman is walking down toward the boats. He is dressed in wool, a heavy overtunic belted at the waist, leggings wrapped at the ankle and knee against the wet. His feet are in simple leather shoes, already wet from the grass. He carries a coil of line over one shoulder. He walks without hurrying. The beach is familiar to him at every hour and in every light. He knows exactly where the boats are, where the ground is soft, where the stones shift underfoot near the water's edge. He stops at the first boat and looks out at the water. He looks at the sky. He looks at the Cumbraes and at the dark shapes of the Norse ships between the island and the shore. He has looked at those ships every morning for the past several days. They have not moved. Their presence is a fact of this shore now, as much as the kelp and the tide, and the line of grey light growing slowly over the hills to the east. The burn is still murmuring across the stones behind him. The cattle are moving quietly in their field. The thatch on the buildings above the shore holds the last of the night damp and will steam gently when the sun reaches it. The light is strengthening now over the Renfrewshire hills. The Firth is coming into colour, a dark, cold blue-grey, with small white points where the tide runs against a shallow place. The day is beginning. The herring nets need checking. The long lines need baiting for the morning set. The net frames above the shore hold work enough for the hours of daylight. The grain in the barn needs turning to prevent spoiling in the autumn damp. The cattle will need moving to fresh ground before midday. The ordinary weight of a working day is settling onto the sky above the Firth of Clyde is still dark. A thin line of grey sits low over the water to the east. The tide is pulling back from the shingle, and the stones are wet and cold beneath it. Largs in 1263 is a small settlement. It sits at the edge of a flat strip of land between the hills and the shore. The hills behind it rise steeply, covered in oak and birch, with open moorland above the tree line. The shore itself is loose shingle and grey sand, stretching north and south in a long, gentle curve. The people who live here are not many, perhaps 200 souls in the settlement and the farmsteads around it. They speak a mixture of Scots and the older Norse-inflected tongue that has been common along this coast for 3 centuries. The language of Galloway Gaelic is not far away either. These are layered people in a layered place. The first to rise this morning are the fishermen. They sleep in low timber-framed houses, the walls packed with turf and clay, the roofs thatched with heather or straw. The floors are beaten earth, sometimes strewn with dried bracken or rushes. There is a central hearth, no chimney, just a hole left in the roof ridge to let the smoke find its way out. The fire does not go out at night. It is banked with peat and left to breathe slowly until morning. A fisherman wakes before the first light. He is a man in his 30s likely, though the work ages people quickly here. He wears a linen undershirt, loose and long, belted at the waist. Over that he pulls a woolen tunic, undyed, the color of the raw fleece, a dull cream or brown depending on the sheep it came from. His leggings are of the same rough wool, wound and tied below the knee. His feet go into simple leather shoes, single-soled, stitched at the side with waxed thread. In the cold months, which October already is, he adds a cloak of heavier wool, pinned at the shoulder with an iron brooch. He does not eat much before going out. A piece of hard bread, perhaps, made from oat flour and baked on a flat stone beside the fire. Sometimes a small bowl of pottage left from the previous evening, oats or dried peas cooked with a little salt, and whatever herbs the household keeps. Leeks, if the garden has them. A few dried berries. He eats standing by the fire or crouching, and he does not linger. The tide will not wait. He walks to the shore in less than 10 minutes from most parts of the settlement. The path is unpaved, rutted and muddy in October. It runs parallel to the waterline, connecting the scattered houses. There are no cobbled streets here, no market square in the sense of a later town. The settlement is a loose gathering of buildings, some close together near the shore, others spread back toward the lower slopes of the hill. His boat is a small open craft, clinker-built, the planks overlapping in the Norse fashion. It is between 12 and 15 feet long. It is pulled up above the tide line each night, heavy enough to require 2 or 3 men to move. The oars are long and simple, cut from local timber and shaped by hand. There is sometimes a small square sail on a single mast, used when the wind comes from the right direction. Most mornings, the men row. The nets are made from twisted plant fiber, hemp or flax, and they are heavy when wet. They are mended constantly. A torn net is a disaster, and every evening that is not spent at sea is often spent in repair. The net-mending needles are carved from bone. They are smooth from years of use, worn down to fit the hand of the man who uses them. These tools are not replaced lightly. The fishermen work the inner firth for herring and haddock. In the right season, there are also mackerel, and shellfish can be gathered along the rock shelves to the north of the bay. Oysters were common in the shallower water here in the 13th century, and cockles could be raked from the sandy patches between the shingle banks. The fish that is not eaten fresh is split, salted, and dried. Salt is a traded commodity here. It comes from inland salt pans or from merchants passing through. A household that runs short of salt before the end of summer is in difficulty by midwinter. Not far from the shore, another household is stirring. This is the house of a craftsman who works in leather. He is a cordwainer by trade, meaning he works with new leather rather than repaired old shoes. The distinction matters in this period. He sources his hides from the farms on the hillside behind the settlement, where cattle and sheep are kept. The hides come to him dried and stiff. He soaks them in water to soften them, stretches them on wooden frames, and then cuts them with a curved iron knife called a head knife, held with both hands drawn toward the body. He rises at the same hour as the fishermen, though he does not need to watch the tide. He eats a small bowl of oatmeal cooked over the hearth fire, thinned with water and salted. Sometimes it is sweetened with a little honey if the household keeps bees, which some do. The beehives in this period are skeps, domed baskets woven from rye straw, set on flat stones at the edge of the garden plot. A leather worker's home has a small yard behind it, enclosed by a low stone wall, where he keeps his wooden frames and his soaking tubs. He walks to his workshop in the same building where he sleeps, or in a separate lean-to structure built against the gable wall. The leather tools hang on wooden pegs or lie on a low bench made from a split timber set on two short posts. His awls are iron-tipped, several different sizes, for piercing the leather at different gauges. His thread is linen, waxed with beeswax. He stitches with two needles at once, passing each through the same hole from opposite sides, a technique that will still be used by hand-stitchers many centuries later. The shoes he makes are soft-soled in the older style, but the fashion is slowly changing. Some commissions now call for a turned welt, a narrow strip of leather sewn between the upper and the sole to give more durability. This is more time-consuming work, and it commands a higher price. Payment in the settlement is not always in coin. A pair of shoes might be exchanged for a portion of grain, or a side of dried fish, or a day's labor on a building project. Further up the slope, where the land begins to rise more steeply toward the tree line, the farming households are also waking. These are the people who hold strips of cultivated land on the lower hillside. The field system here is the open field arrangement common to much of Scotland in this century. Each household works a number of strips, scattered across the field, rather than one consolidated holding. This distributes the good and bad soil more evenly between families. The crops at this time of year are mostly already in. October is past the main harvest. The oat crop would have been cut in late August and September, the grain threshed with wooden flails on a flat stone or a beaten earth threshing floor, then stored in the rafters of the house or in a separate small barn. The straw is kept for bedding and for thatching repair. Nothing is wasted. What remains in the field in October is the stubble and the kale. Kale is a vital crop in this climate and this century. It is hardy enough to stand through frost, and it provides green food through the lean months when everything else is gone. The kale yard is a small enclosed plot, usually close to the house, protected from animals by a low stone wall or a woven wattle fence. Every farming household in Largs in 1263 has one or something close to it. A farmer rises and pulls on his working clothes. They are not so different from the fisherman's. Wool tunic, wool leggings, leather shoes, a cloak or heavy overshirt for the cold. But his tools are different. He carries a wooden-handled iron spade for turning soil and a bill hook for cutting back the bramble and scrub at the field edges. His scythe, if he owns one, hangs inside the house. Iron is expensive. A scythe blade is not something left out in the rain. He eats before going out. His household is likely a little larger than the fisherman's. A wife, children, perhaps an elderly relative. The morning meal is communal, taken around the fire. Oat pottage again, perhaps with a little dried meat added, smoked mutton or salted pork from a pig slaughtered in the autumn. The smoked meat hangs from the roof beams above the hearth, drying slowly in the constant low smoke. The flavor it acquires is particular to the peat and the wood being burned in that house. He walks to his strips of land in perhaps 15 to 20 minutes. The paths between the settlement and the fields are worn into the hillside by years of daily use. They are narrow, single file, and steep in places. He knows every turn and every stone in the path without looking. He has walked it since he was old enough to follow his father out in the morning. Back near the shore, there is another kind of work beginning. The settlement of Largs in 1263 is not isolated from trade. It sits on the Firth of Clyde, one of the most significant waterways in western Scotland. Goods move up and down this firth constantly. Timber comes down from the hills. Grain moves between settlements. Salt, iron, and cloth come from further afield, from Ayr to the south or from the boroughs further up the firths. There is at least one merchant household in the settlement, a person who deals in the movement and exchange of goods rather than their production. This is not a wealthy merchant in the sense of a later town trader, but a man who owns a larger boat, perhaps 20 feet or more, capable of carrying cargo. He arranges the movement of dried fish to inland buyers, or the supply of iron goods from a smith in Ayr to the craftsmen here. He rises later than the fishermen. His work is governed not by the tide alone, but by the agreements he has made and the weather over the firth. On a morning in October 1263, he looks at the sky before deciding anything. The Firth of Clyde can turn quickly at this time of year. A clear morning can give way to a hard southwesterly by noon. His reading of the weather is not guesswork. It is a skill built from years on this water. There is a smith at the edge of the settlement as well. The smithy is always set apart from other buildings because of the fire risk. It is a low stone structure with a forge of heaped stone at one end and a bellows made from stitched leather and wood. The anvil is a large block of iron set on a section of hardwood trunk. The floor of the smithy is bare earth, black with iron scale and ash. The smith is up earliest of all the craftsmen. His fire must be brought up to heat before he can begin, and that takes time. He uses charcoal, not just raw wood, because charcoal burns hotter and cleaner. The charcoal is made in pits on the edge of the woodland above the settlement, slow burned over several days from oak and birch cut in lengths. The smell of it is in the smithy walls, in his clothes, in the thatch above the forge. He eats nothing before starting the fire. He drinks water, perhaps, from a wooden bucket kept near the door. His morning meal will come later, brought by a member of his household once the fire is established and the first piece of work is underway. He is making a replacement blade for a draw knife, a tool used by the boat builders further along the shore for shaping timber. The work requires steady heat and careful control of the hammer. His hammers are several sizes. The heaviest is used to draw out and flatten the iron when it is white hot. A lighter crossbeam hammer shapes the edge. He holds the iron with long-handled tongs, turning it in the fire and on the anvil in a rhythm that is almost entirely instinctive. The iron tells him what it needs by its color. White is too hot. A dull red means the work must stop and the iron returned to the fire. The boat builders, he is making the blade for work at the northern end of the shore. There is a flat area of shingle there, sheltered slightly by a low ridge of rock, where timber can be brought down from the hillside and worked close to the water. In October 1263, there is a vessel in various stages of construction on this patch of shore. It is a working boat, not large, but built for the conditions of the inner Firth. The keel has been laid on wooden supports, and the first planks of the hull are being shaped, and the tide came in before dawn. By the time the sky above the Clyde had lightened to a pale grey, the fishermen of Largs were already at the shore. They had been up since well before first light. The boats needed checking before anything else could begin. The settlement at Largs in 1263 sat close to the water's edge, its back against a low ridge of hills that ran roughly parallel to the coast. The ground between the hills and the sea was not wide. The houses and the shore were never far apart. A man could walk from his sleeping place to the tide line in fewer than 3 minutes. The boats drawn up on that shore were small by any later standard. They were mostly open craft, built from overlapping strakes of oak, the planks fixed with iron rivets and caulked with moss and tar. Each boat was perhaps 20 feet in length. They were heavy enough to need 2 or 3 men to drag them down the shingle when the tide was out. The wood was dark with salt and use. The fishermen worked the Firth of Clyde for herring primarily. Herring was the great fish of the west coast in the 13th century. It ran in enormous shoals through the deeper channels of the Firth, particularly in the late summer and the autumn months. September was a good month for herring. October could be better still. The fish came close to the surface in the cooler water, and a well-placed net could fill a boat in an hour. The nets themselves were made from hemp. The fibers were twisted and knotted by hand, a slow process that occupied the winter months when the weather made open water fishing impossible. Women and older children did much of this work, seated inside or just outside the low doorways of the houses. A net long enough to be useful in the Firth might take several weeks to make. Once finished, it was weighted along its lower edge with small stones, each one drilled through the middle and threaded onto the cord. Along the upper edge ran floats made from dried and sealed animal bladders. The nets were shot from the stern of the boat in the evening, left overnight, and hauled in the following morning. That was the rhythm of the work in herring season. The men would row out into the Firth as the light faded, drop their nets in a long line, anchor the nearest end with a weighted rope, and mark the far end with a float made from a bundle of reeds. Then they would row back, sleep a few hours, and return before the sun was properly up. Hauling the nets was the hardest part of the morning. The work was done by hand, no windlass or block, and tackle of any refinement. The men leaned over the gunwale and pulled the net up hand over hand, shaking the herring loose as they came aboard. The fish fell into the bottom of the boat in a silver mass, still moving. The smell was clean and cold in the early air, salt water and fish, and wet hemp all together. A good haul might fill the floor of the boat to the depth of a man's knee. On a poor morning, there would be enough to cover the boards, but no more. The men knew the difference before they had finished hauling. They could feel it in the weight of the net as it came up. The boats came back to the shore below the main settlement. There was no formal harbour at Largs in this period. The shoreline was shingle and sand, and the boats were beached directly onto it. The bows were run up onto the stones, and the catch was offloaded into wooden tubs, each one carried up the beach by the fishermen themselves or by boys who worked alongside them. The tubs were heavy when full. A man carried one in both arms or balanced it against his hip. The fish were then taken to the women who waited higher up the beach. The gutting began immediately. Speed mattered because herring spoils faster than almost any other fish. Each herring was slit along the belly with a small iron knife, the blade no longer than a man's finger. The guts were removed in a single pull and dropped into a separate tub. The gutted fish were rinsed in seawater and then salted. Salt was an essential material in Largs in 1263, and its supply was carefully managed. It came partly from salt pans further along the Ayrshire coast, and partly from trade with merchants who carried it in by boat from other parts of the kingdom, and sometimes from further away. Without sufficient salt, a good herring catch was almost worthless. The salt was stored in a dry building set back from the water, with a low stone wall and a roof of turf. Access to it was controlled. The salting process was straightforward. Herring were laid in layers inside wooden barrels, each layer covered with a measure of coarse salt. A barrel might hold 300 fish when packed tightly. When the barrel was full, a bung was hammered into the top, and the barrel was set aside to cure. After a week or more, the fish would be preserved well enough to travel. Salted herring could reach markets many miles inland before spoiling. The barrels themselves were made locally. There were coopers working in the settlement, men whose entire trade was the making and repairing of wooden casks. A cooper's tools were simple but specific. He used a drawknife to shave the staves to the correct curve, a jointer plane to smooth the edges so that they would sit flush against one another, and a hammer and iron driver to set the hoops. The hoops in this period were usually made from split hazel or ash rather than iron, though iron hoops were known, and used where the metal could be obtained. The sound of coopering carried some distance on a still morning. The hammer blows when setting a hoop had a particular resonance, a hollow wooden knock that repeated in a fast rhythm as the cooper worked his way around the barrel. The scrape of the drawknife on a wet stave made a lower, more continuous sound. These noises mixed with the sound of the surf on the shingle and the calling of the gulls that gathered whenever the gutting tubs were in use. The gulls were always present. They followed the boats out onto the Firth, and they were waiting when the boats came back. They sat along the upper edge of the beach, several dozen of them at any given time, and moved in whenever scraps were thrown. The gutted offal went into the sea or onto the strand, and the birds took it quickly. This was an unremarkable part of the morning, simply part of the scene that everyone in the settlement had grown up with. Beyond the immediate work of the fishing, there were other trades operating in logs by this period. The settlement was not large, but it was established enough to have a mill. The mill stood slightly inland, making use of one of the small burns that came down from the hills to the east. The burn ran fairly reliably through the summer and into the autumn, and the mill wheel, an undershot wheel of perhaps 12 feet in diameter, turned most of the year. The grinding of grain was as important to the settlement as the fishing, perhaps more so in the sense that bread was the daily foundation of every meal. The grain being ground in September 1263 would have been oats, primarily. Oats were the dominant cereal crop of western Scotland in the 13th century. They grew where barley and wheat could not easily establish themselves, tolerating the wet and the wind better than either. The fields surrounding logs were small by later agricultural standards, divided into the long, narrow strips of the runrig system, each strip belonging to a different tenant household. The strips ran down slopes wherever possible to allow drainage, and the soil between them was raised into low ridges for the same reason. Oats harvested in August and early September needed to be dried before milling. If they were ground damp, the meal would clump and spoil quickly. The drying was done in a kiln, a small stone structure with a perforated stone or clay floor over a low fire of peat. The grain was spread on the floor, and the heat from below drove the moisture out. A man or an older child would tend the kiln fire through the drying period, keeping the temperature steady and turning the grain occasionally with a wooden paddle. Once dried, the grain was brought to the mill in sacks. The sacks were made from coarse woven cloth, stitched at the seams with heavy thread. A full sack of oats was a substantial load. A man could carry one slung across his back, but the weight made the walk from the fields to the mill an effort. The distance might be a quarter of a mile or less, but the path ran across uneven ground, and the load shifted with every step. At the mill, the grain was poured into the hopper above the upper millstone. The stone drew it down through the central hole and ground it between the two stone faces as the wheel turned. The lower stone was fixed. The upper stone rotated. The meal fell from between the stones into a wooden trough that ran around the outside of the millstones at floor level. The miller or his assistant gathered it up with a wooden scoop and transferred it to another sack. The mill produced oatmeal of a fairly coarse grade. It could be refined further by sieving, but for most households in Largs, the coarse meal was what they used. It was made into porridge by boiling with water in an iron pot over a peat fire. It was also made into flatbreads, mixed with water or whey into a stiff dough and cooked on a flat iron griddle set over the fire. The griddle was called a girdle in the Scots of this region and period, and it was one of the most essential pieces of equipment in any household. The peat for the fires came from the higher ground to the east, where the blanket bog lay thick on the moorland above the cultivated land. Peat cutting had taken place in the late spring, when the blocks were easy to slice from the wet ground with a specialized iron spade called a tusker. The blocks had been stacked in small pyramids on the open hillside through the summer to dry, and by September they were ready to carry down. Men and older boys made the journey up to the peat ground and back, carrying loads in creels, large wicker baskets worn on the back with a strap across the forehead. A creel load of dry peat was not enormously heavy, but it was bulky, and the path back down the hill was steep enough in places to require care. The smell of peat smoke was constant in Largs throughout the working day. It came from the domestic fires in the houses, from the kiln when grain was being dried, and from the smoking shed down near the shore, where some of the herring catch was smoked rather than salted. Smoking was a secondary preservation method used for fish that were intended to be eaten in the settlement itself rather than traded over longer distances. The smoke shed was a low structure of stone and wood, with gaps left in the roof to allow the smoke to draw upward without accumulating so thickly that it extinguished the fire below. The fire in the smoke shed burned oak chips and sometimes peat. The herring were hung on wooden rods set across the interior of the shed at about head height. The smoking took the best part of a day for a light smoke, longer if a heavier preservation was wanted. The fish came out of the process a deep golden brown, the skin dry and slightly tacky to the touch, the flesh firm. Eaten with oat bread, smoked herring was the staple midday meal for most of the settlement's working population. The men who were not fishing or coopering or milling were likely engaged in the maintenance of equipment. Nets were always in need of repair. The hemp fibers broke under repeated use, and the salt water degraded them more quickly than the fishermen would have preferred. A man might spend a full morning mending a net, seated on the upper beach with the net spread across his knees, pushing a bone or wooden needle through the mesh to tie off each broken strand. The needle was a simple tool, a flat piece of bone with a notch at each end to hold the working thread, perhaps 4 inches long and shaped to a blunt point. The repair of the boats was also an ongoing task. The iron rivets that held the overlapping strakes together could work loose, particularly after heavy use or a difficult voyage. Caulking deteriorated and needed renewing. The pitch and tar used to seal the hull below the waterline had to be applied periodically. A messy, and time-consuming job that required the boat to be turned upside down on the beach. A small fire was built to heat the tar until it ran, and it was worked into the seams with a wooden paddle and pressed in with a caulking iron, a blunt chisel-like tool struck with a wooden mallet. The sound of that mallet carried down the beach on the morning air, mixing with the hammer of the cooper and the grinding of the mill and the low conversation of the women at the gutting tubs. The tide was pulling back from the shingle now. The morning was properly underway. The light on the Firth was grey and flat, and out on the water, perhaps half a mile from shore, two small boats were still making there. The tide is going out at Largs. The shingle beach lies quiet in the late afternoon. The last of the light sits low over the water, catching the tops of the small waves as they pull back from the stones. The houses of Largs in 1263 stood close to the shore and on the low ground behind it. They were not large buildings. Most were single-roomed structures, built from a timber frame packed with wattle and sealed with a daub of clay and dung. The roofs were thatched with heather or with reeds cut from the boggy ground inland. There were no upper floors. A family lived, ate, and slept in one room with the fire burning at the center of it. The floor was beaten earth. In some houses, it had been packed so hard over many years that it was almost as firm as stone. Rushes were laid across it, changed when they became too dirty or too damp. The fire sat in a shallow pit in the middle of the room. There was no chimney. The smoke rose through the thatch, finding its way out slowly. The interior of such a house was almost always dim and smoky, and the underside of the thatch grew black with soot over the years. Furniture was minimal. A low trestle table could be dismantled and set aside at night. Benches served for sitting and for sleeping. A household of some means might have a wooden chest used to store cloth and small items of value. Hooks driven into the timber frame held tools, bags, and clothing. The walls were not bare. Bundles of dried plants hung from the rafters, along with strips of dried fish and, in autumn, cuts of salted meat. The hearth was the center of the house. A clay or iron pot sat over it, suspended from a chain or rested on flat stones at the fire's edge. In a household along the Ayrshire coast in the 13th century, the pot was rarely cold. Pottage was the common food. It was made from whatever was to hand: oats, barley, dried peas, leeks, turnips, wild herbs gathered from the hillside. A small amount of salt was added when there was enough of it. On days when fish had been caught, a piece of it went into the pot as well. Largs sat on a stretch of coast where the sea provided a reliable supply of food. Herring were taken in quantity from the Firth of Clyde. They were caught in nets from small open boats, brought ashore, and either eaten fresh within the day or preserved by salting and drying. A family with access to enough salt could lay up a store of fish that would last through the winter months. Cod and haddock were also taken. Shellfish could be gathered from the rocks without a boat at all. Mussels and limpets were a common part of the diet, particularly among those too poor to have fishing equipment of their own. Bread was eaten, but not in the quantities that grain farming communities further inland might manage. The land around Largs rose quickly into the hills behind the town. It was not easy arable ground. Oats were grown on the better coastal strips. Barley was grown as well, and a small part of the barley crop went to the making of ale. The bread made from oats was flat and dense. It was baked on a flat stone set over the fire or raked directly onto the hearthstone itself. It did not rise. It was eaten the same day it was made because it did not keep. A household in 1263 kept animals where it could. A cow was a considerable possession. It provided milk, and from the milk came butter and a soft, fresh cheese. The cow was also eventually slaughtered, usually in late autumn when the cost of feeding it through winter became too great. The meat was salted down and stored. Goats were more common than cows among ordinary families. They were hardier animals, better suited to the rough ground behind the coast. Pigs were kept where there was enough food waste to sustain them. Chickens were kept for eggs. The eggs were a useful daily food that required no cooking if none was possible. Children in such a household were put to work as soon as they were able to do anything useful. A child of 5 or 6 could carry water, feed chickens, gather fuel, or watch over a younger sibling. There was no schooling for children of ordinary families in Largs in 1263. The church might provide some basic instruction in Latin prayers for boys intended for the clergy, but this was not the life expected of most children. Boys learned their father's work by following him and doing it alongside him. Girls learned the running of a household by working in the household from an early age. The clothing of the family was wool. Wool was spun at home on a hand spindle. It was woven on a simple loom, the kind that could be set up in the single room of the house and taken down when not in use. The cloth produced was coarse and undyed, or dyed in muted browns and greens using plants found locally. Men wore a long linen shirt next to the skin, with a woolen tunic over it, belted at the waist. Women wore a similar long linen garment with a woolen overdress. Everyone wore a mantle, a large, roughly rectangular piece of woolen cloth that served as a coat and as a blanket and as a covering in the night. Shoes were made from untanned hide, cut and stitched into simple shapes. Many people went barefoot through the summer months. The loom occupied a corner of the room when it was in use. Spinning was done in any spare moment, by firelight in the evenings, by the door in daylight when the weather allowed. Women span while they watched children or while they sat outside the house in the morning sun. The thread produced was uneven by later standards, but it was serviceable. A household produced most of its own cloth. Some households produced more than they needed and traded the surplus. The door of a house in Largs in 1263 faced away from the prevailing wind where possible. The west and southwest winds off the Firth of Clyde were persistent and cold for much of the year. A door of split timber hung on wooden pegs set into the frame. There was no glass in any window. Light came through a small gap left in the wall, covered in winter with a piece of oiled hide or a loosely woven cloth that allowed some light through while reducing the worst of the cold. A house at night, with the door shut and the hide over the window, was almost completely dark except for the fire. The fire was the source of heat, light, and cooked food. It was not allowed to go out if it could be helped. Embers were banked at night with ash to keep them alive until morning. If the fire did go out, it had to be relit. In 1263, this was done with a striker light, a piece of iron struck against a flint to produce a spark, caught in a small quantity of dry tinder. It was a slow business in damp weather. A household that kept its fire burning saved itself this trouble. Fuel on the coast at Largs was gathered from the hillsides, dried heather, scrubby wood from the slopes, peat cut from the boggy ground and dried through the summer. Driftwood from the beach was collected and used as well. Water was carried from a spring or a stream. There was no piped water of any kind. A household might keep 2 or 3 clay pots for water, as well as the cooking pot. The water was used for cooking, for drinking, and for occasional washing of hands and face. Bathing as a regular practice was not part of the life of an ordinary household. Hands were washed before eating. A cloth was used to wipe the face. The floor rushes absorbed a good deal of what fell on them and were replaced when they became too foul. Animals sometimes shared the building, particularly in winter. A cow or a goat brought inside at night added warmth to the room. The smell was considerable, but warmth was more important than smell in a Scottish winter on the Firth of Clyde. Some buildings were specifically arranged with a byre at one end and the living quarters at the other, divided by a low partition. Others brought animals in only during the coldest weeks. By the standards of the time, having a cow indoors on a January night was not considered unusual or uncomfortable. The household slept together. There was no separate sleeping room. At night, the benches were pulled back and the family lay near the fire, wrapped in their mantles and in whatever other cloth the household possessed. A straw-stuffed mattress, where one existed, lay on the bench or directly on the floor. Children slept between adults, close to the warmth of the fire. The door was barred from inside with a wooden beam set into slots on either side of the frame. The year's rhythm governed everything. Spring brought longer days and the return of fishing in better weather. Seed was put in the ground on the low coastal strips. Animals that had survived the winter were let out to graze on the rough hillside pasture. Summer was the busiest season. Peat was cut and dried. Hay was gathered from the small meadows. Fish were caught and preserved. Berries were picked from the hillsides, raspberries, brambles, rowans, bilberries. They were eaten fresh or boiled down with honey where honey was available. The church stood at the center of the community's sense of time and duty. In 1263, there was a church at Largs, and its year of saints' days and feast days and fast days shaped the rhythm of eating as much as the availability of food did. On fast days, meat was not eaten. Fish was eaten instead. For a coastal community at Largs, this was not a hardship. The sea provided what the church required on the days it required it. The church also collected tithes. A tenth part of a household's produce was owed to the church. A family with a cow gave a measure of its cheese and butter. A fishing family gave a portion of its catch. The children of Largs in 1263 grew up speaking Scots Gaelic. The language of the western coast and the islands was Gaelic, and the population around the Firth of Clyde at this time was Gaelic-speaking in its daily life. The Norse presence in the region had also left its mark. The families living on this stretch of Ayrshire coast in the mid-13th century would have been familiar with Norse names for places, for boats, for tools. Some families had Norse blood from several generations of settlement and intermarriage. The sea that lay before them was the same sea that connected them to the Norse-held islands to the west and north. The boats pulled up on the Largs beach in 1263 were small and clinker-built. They had shallow drafts suited to the shelving shore. They were rowed out and sailed back, or rowed both ways if the wind was wrong. The sail, when there was one, was a single square sail of heavy woolen cloth. The boats were owned by individual fishermen or by small groups of men working together. They were kept above the tide line and turned over when not in use, to protect them from the weather. The wood was kept dressed with tar where tar was available, or with oil rendered from fish. A woman in such a household in 1263 managed nearly everything that kept the family alive. She cooked, she spun and wove, she preserved food, she tended the animals, she gathered fuel and carried water, she managed the children, she treated illness with what knowledge she had of plants and their uses. She knew which plants reduced a fever and which stopped bleeding. This knowledge passed from mother to daughter without being written down. It existed entirely in memory and in practice. The men of Largs fished, mended nets, worked the small strips of cultivated ground, cut peat, tended animals, and built and repaired the houses and boats. The division of work between men and women was clear and long-standing. It was not commented on or explained. It simply was the shape of a life. A man who could not mend a net or handle a boat on the Firth of Clyde was poorly placed. A woman who could not spin or manage a pot over a fire was in equal difficulty. The evening meal was eaten before the light failed completely. There was no reliable means of illumination beyond the fire and a rush light, a dried rush dipped in fat, which gave a small and wavering flame. Candles existed, but tallow candles were a modest expense for a family that had little to spare. The fire gave the most light and the most heat, and the family gathered close to it. Bowls were wood or fired clay. Spoons were carved from wood or bone. There were no forks. Bread was used to scoop from a shared bowl where bread was available. The meal was eaten in silence or in low conversation, the fire throwing its light against the dark walls of the single room, the smoke curling upward into the blackened thatch above, the sound of the Firth of Clyde just audible beyond. The tide had gone out by the time the last boats were dragged above the rack line. The shore at Largs was grey shingle and dark sand, and the smell of salt and kelp lay over everything. It was September of 1263, and the days were shortening. The settlement at Largs was not large. It sat at the edge of the Firth of Clyde, with the hills of Cunningham rising steeply behind it. The ground between the shore and the hills was narrow. People built where the land allowed it. Most of the buildings were timber-framed, with walls of wattle daubed with clay and animal dung. Roofs were thatched with broom or reeds gathered from the marshy ground to the north. There were no grand stone houses here, not yet. The parish church was the only substantial stone building most people would have known. That church stood inland from the shore by a short walk. It was dedicated, as many churches in this part of Ayrshire were, to a local tradition of early Christian observance. The building would have been simple, a single nave, a small chancel, walls of roughly coursed stone. The interior was dim, lit by tallow candles on feast days and by thin light through unglazed windows on ordinary mornings. Sunday came around every 7 days, and it marked a real break in the week. Work in the fields stopped. Fishing boats were pulled up and left. The smithy was cold. People walked to the church, and they walked together because walking together was part of it. The path from the shore settlement to the church door was worn smooth by generations of feet. The priest spoke the Mass in Latin. The congregation stood because there were no pews. Children stood at the front or near their mothers. Old men stood at the back, near the door where they could lean against the wall. The service was not short, but people were used to standing. They stood at their work all week. After the Mass there was time. Sunday afternoons in a settlement like Largs were not idle in the modern sense, but they were slower. The restrictions on labor were real, enforced partly by custom and partly by the authority of the church. A man could not plough on a Sunday. He could walk, talk, trade small things informally, and tend to animals that needed immediate care. People gathered near the church after the service. This was one of the few reliable gathering points in the week. News moved by word of mouth, and the church door was where much of it passed. A fisherman would say what he had seen out on the Firth. A woman from the farms to the south would mention that her neighbor's cow had calved. Small facts accumulated. The community knew itself through these exchanges. The year was shaped more by the church calendar than by any other structure. There were around 40 feast days observed in Scotland in this period, spread across the 12 months. Each one marked a pause in ordinary labor. Some were more significant than others. The Feast of All Saints on the 1st of November was one of the great moments of the autumn. It fell close to the end of the harvest, and it carried with it a sense of the year turning. Before that, in September and October, the work was concentrated and relentless. The grain had to come in. In the fields behind Largs, where the ground was workable, people grew oats and berra barley. These were the staple crops of the west of Scotland. Oats made the porridge that was eaten most mornings. Barley went into ale, which was drunk at every meal, because the water from shallow wells was not always safe. Harvest time was communal labor. The lord of the land, whoever held authority over this stretch of Cunningham, could call his tenants to work in his fields before they worked their own. This was the system of thirlage and customary labor obligation. A man owed his lord days of work, and harvest was when those days were called in. The whole settlement moved together through the standing grain, cutting with iron-bladed sickles. The grain was laid in sheaves and left to dry. Then it was carried to the barn or to whatever covered storage the farm possessed. The threshing would come later, through the autumn and into winter, the rhythmic beating of flails on stone floors, separating grain from straw. The straw itself was not wasted. It went under the cattle in the byre, and it stuffed the mattresses on which people slept. Martinmas fell on the 11th of November, and it was one of the great practical turning points of the year. This was the day when cattle that could not be fed through the winter were slaughtered. A settlement on the Firth of Clyde did not have enough hay stored to keep every animal alive until spring. The beasts that were surplus were killed, and the meat was salted and packed into barrels. The smell of blood and brine was part of November. Martinmas was also a term day. Rents were due. Labor obligations were settled. Any man who had hired himself out for the season would collect what he was owed. There was a practical business to the day that sat alongside the religious observance. The priest said prayers for the animals killed, as he would at other moments of agricultural necessity. Markets were not held at Largs with the regularity of a large borough. Largs in 1263 was not yet a royal borough. It did not have the formal market rights that a place like Ayr or Irvine possessed. Ayr was the significant trading centre to the south, and goods moved to and from it along the coastal tracks. But there were informal exchanges at Largs, the kind that happened wherever people gathered. The shore itself was a marketplace of a kind. When a fishing boat came in with more herring than the crew could use, the surplus was sold on the beach. A woman with a basket of eggs could trade them for a measure of dried fish. These transactions left no records. They happened in the open air, beside the boats, with the Firth grey and wide behind them. The herring fishery on the Firth of Clyde was already old by 1263. Herring moved in dense shoals along the coast in autumn, and every settlement on the Firth turned to them. The boats used at Largs would have been small, open wooden vessels, propelled by oar and a simple sail. A crew of 3 or 4 men could handle such a boat. The nets they used were made of hemp, weighted with stones at the bottom and held up by floats of cork or dried reed. Salt was essential, and salt was not made at Largs. It came by boat from the salt pans further along the Firth or from further afield. A community without salt could not preserve fish or meat. The acquisition and storage of salt was a serious matter. A man who controlled salt had something others needed. The boats also carried other trade goods along the Firth. Timber came down from the upland glens in cut sections. Hides from slaughtered cattle moved toward the larger boroughs where there were tanners. Wool, clipped in early summer from the sheep that grazed the hillsides of Cunningham, was bundled and carried to where it could be sold. The Firth of Clyde was a highway, and Largs was one of many small stops along it. Christmas, which was called the Feast of the Nativity, was a 12-day observance running from the 25th of December to the 6th of January. In a settlement like Largs, this was a time of relative rest. The fields were empty. The boats went out less often in the short, cold days. People stayed near their fires. Ale was drunk. Whatever dried meat and fish had been stored was eaten more freely than at other times. The fires inside the houses burned peat, cut from the upland bogs during summer and stacked to dry. Peat burns slowly and gives out a steady heat. The smell of it was constant, embedded in the walls, the clothing, the hair of everyone who lived there. A house in Largs in 1263 smelled of peat smoke, of cattle, of salt fish, of tallow, and of the unwashed wool that people wore. Wool was what most people wore. A woman's dress was a long linen shift under a woolen overdress belted at the waist. A man wore a woolen tunic reaching to the knee with woolen hose and leather shoes. The leather was simple, soled with a single piece of hide. Shoes wore out. Cobblers did not practice their trade in every small settlement, and a man might go without good shoes for months. The church at Largs would have had its own small observances for the feast days specific to local saints. Columba was venerated throughout the west of Scotland, and his feast on the 9th of June marked the beginning of a warmer season. People might walk to the church on that day with small offerings. The priest would say additional prayers. The day was not a holiday from field work in the way that Christmas or Easter was, but it was marked. Easter itself was the highest point of the church year. The calculation of its date shifted each year, falling somewhere between late March and late April. In the weeks before Easter, during Lent, the restrictions on food were strict. No meat, no dairy. People ate fish, dried or salted, and oat bread, and whatever root vegetables remained from the winter store. By the end of Lent, the stores were running low, and the hunger of late winter was real. Easter Sunday broke the fast. Whatever meat was available was cooked. A settlement on the coast had fish in abundance even then, but the return to meat was celebrated. People went to the church in the morning. They came away into a day that was, in most years, cold but lengthening. The lambs had been born. The first shoots of grass were visible in the fields. Whitsun, 7 weeks after Easter, marked another gathering point. In Scotland in this period, it was one of the recognized term days, a moment for settling debts and obligations. A man owed his priest a tithe, a tenth of his annual produce. The collection of tithes was not always smooth. A priest in a small parish, like Largs, collected what he could, in grain or fish or livestock, and stored it in a tithe barn or in his own small house. The priest himself was part of the community in a way that later periods would change. He was not a distant authority. He lived among the people of the parish. He knew who was sick, who had quarreled, whose boat had been damaged in a storm. He administered the sacraments, baptism for the newborn, last rites for the dying, and the regular cycle of Mass in between. The most likely gathering place for ordinary conversation outside the church was the shore. The beach at Largs was where men came to work on their boats, to spread and mend their nets, to help launch or haul up a vessel. Women came to the water to wash linen in the cold tide edge. Children played at the waterline and learned by watching what the adults were doing. The hills behind the settlement were not empty. Cattle were driven up to the summer grazings in late spring and brought back down before winter. This practice, known broadly as transhumance, was standard throughout the Scottish uplands and was followed here too. A young man or a woman might spend the summer months at a shealing hut high up in the hills, making butter and cheese, before returning to the lower settlement in September. That return in September brought its own kind of gathering. The cattle came back down, leaner than they had gone up, but having sustained themselves through the summer without drawing on the lowland pasture. The cheese made over the summer was stored for winter eating. These were not luxuries, but necessities. The calculation of how much food a family needed to survive until the next harvest was made carefully, and it was made every year. The autumn of 1263 was different from other autumns in one specific and significant way. A Norwegian fleet under King Hakon IV had sailed down the western coast of Scotland. The fleet was large. Some accounts suggest over 100 vessels. It had come to assert Norwegian sovereignty over the Western Isles, which were a contested border between the Kingdom of Norway and the Kingdom of Scotland. The fleet anchored off the coast near Largs in late September. The precise date of the engagement that followed was the 2nd of October, 1263. What the people on the shore at Largs saw in the days before that date was a horizon filled with ships. The longships and larger vessels of the Norwegian fleet sat out in the Firth. The ordinary work of the settlement, the mending of nets, the cutting of peat, the preparation for Martinmas, continued alongside this extraordinary fact. The boats were there. Everyone on that shore could see them. The tide was going out on the Firth of Clyde. The water pulled back slowly from the shingle at Largs, leaving dark strands of bladderwrack across the stones. It was late in the year. The light came low from the southwest, and it did not last long. The Firth here was wide. From the shore at Largs, you could see the long ridge of Arran to the southwest, and the nearer mass of Great Cumbraes sitting in the channel, perhaps 3 miles out. The water between the mainland and Cumbraes was not deep. Small boats crossed it in under an hour when the wind was right. When the wind came from the north, nothing moved. The settlement at Largs sat at the foot of a steep escarpment. Behind the shore the land rose sharply. The hill ground began almost immediately. There was a narrow coastal strip of workable land, perhaps half a mile wide at its broadest, running between the water and the rising moor. This strip was where people lived and worked. It did not extend far in any direction. The burn called the Gogo Water came down from the high ground to the east and crossed this coastal strip before entering the Firth. It ran fast after rain. The upper reaches of the Gogo drained a wide stretch of moorland, and in autumn the flow was heavy and brown. Lower down, near the shore, the burn slowed and spread a little. The ground on either side was soft. Cattle had trampled the banks into mud by this time of year. A generation before, in the 1230s, that same burn ran through much the same country. The difference was in the detail. The woodland along its lower reaches was thicker then. Alder and willow grew close to the water. Some of the higher valley sides still carried oak and hazel that by 1263 had been cleared or thinned. The clearing had been slow, carried out not in any single season, but year by year, as steadings needed timber, as animals needed pasture, as the small pieces of infield ground were extended where the slope allowed it. The infield ground near Largs in 1263 was narrow and divided into rigs. The rigs were long, low ridges of cultivated soil, each perhaps 5 or 6 feet wide, separated by shallow drainage channels. They followed the shape of the land. On the flat ground near the burn mouth, the rigs ran straight. On the slopes above they curved with the contour. Oats were the main crop. Barley grew on the better drained ground closer to the shore. Both had been harvested by now. The stalks were cut low and the grain stored. The rigs stood bare and grey under the November sky. The ground beyond the infield was outfield. It was cropped less often. Every few years, a section of outfield would be broken and sown with oats, then left to recover. The rest of the time it carried rough grazing. Cattle and sheep moved across it through the summer months. By the time the days shortened in October, the animals had been brought back down to the settlement. Some would be slaughtered before the hardest weather. Others would be kept through the winter on hay cut from the low meadow ground along the burn. The moorland above the settlement rose to over 1,000 feet. It was wet ground, covered in heather and deer grass and cotton grass. There were patches of blanket bog where the drainage was worst. The peat here was deep. It had been forming for several thousand years. People from the settlement cut peat from the lower edges of the moor for fuel. The cuttings were shallow trenches, easy to step over. The cut blocks were dried through the summer and brought down before winter. A generation earlier, the moor carried a slightly different character. The lower margins had not yet been cut so often. The heather was taller in places. There were more areas of wet grassland transitioning to heath, where cattle had not yet grazed so heavily. By 1263, the grazing pressure on the lower moor had increased somewhat. There were more animals, and they were kept on the same ground. The grass near the settlement was cropped short. The heather line had been pushed a little higher up the hill. The shore itself was a different kind of resource. The beach at Largs was mostly pebble and coarse sand. At low tide, a stretch of rock and kelp was exposed to the south of the main settlement. People gathered shellfish from this ground. Mussels and limpets were both collected. They were eaten fresh in season and dried or salted for use later. The work was done in the early morning before the tide returned. Children often did it. The Firth was a productive fishing ground. Herring moved through the channel in large shoals during the autumn months. Small boats went out from the shore at Largs to fish them. The boats were light craft, not large. They were worked by 2 or 3 men. Nets were shot in the evening and hauled before first light. The herring catch in a good year was substantial. Much of it was salted and packed in barrels for storage. The salt came from elsewhere. It was traded. Cod and haddock were also taken from the Firth, though not in the same numbers as herring. Line fishing was used for these. The lines were long, with multiple hooks, and were set from the boats then hauled. The work was cold in October and November. The men who did it wore wool. Their clothes were not fine. They were thick and practical, and smelled of fish and peat smoke. The harbour at Largs in 1263 was not a built structure. There was no stone quay. Boats were drawn up on the beach above the tide line. There may have been a simple timber framework to help haul the largest vessels clear of the water. The landing place was sheltered to some degree by the lie of the coast and by the presence of Cumbraes in the channel, which broke the worst of the westerly weather. But it was exposed. In a hard storm from the southwest, the beach was dangerous. A generation before, the harbour arrangements were similar. There was no substantial improvement in the landing place between the 1230s and 1263. What changed was the level of traffic. By the middle of the 13th century, Largs was more regularly visited by boats passing through the Firth. The channel between the mainland and Cumbraes was part of a busy coastal route. Galleys moving between the Western Isles and the inner Firth passed through it. Smaller trading vessels used the same route. The anchorage off Largs was a reasonable overnight stop. The Norse presence in this part of the Firth was real and had been so for centuries. The Isle of Man lay to the southwest. The Hebrides lay to the north and west. Both were under Norwegian authority in this period. The sea lanes running through the Firth of Clyde were contested in a loose and persistent way. The people living at Largs were aware of this. It was part of the ordinary background of their lives, not an emergency, but a condition. The Cumbraes Islands sit in the channel as they always have. Great Cumbraes is the larger. Little Cumbraes lies further south. In 1263, both islands were grazed. Cattle were kept on Great Cumbraes through the summer months. The grass there was good on the lower ground. The island had a small resident population. It was accessible from Largs by boat in calm conditions, and the crossing was made regularly. The seasonal pattern at Largs followed the rhythm of the land and the water together. Spring came slowly on this coast. The ground stayed cold into April. Sowing began when the soil was workable. Cattle were let out from their winter housing when the grass began to grow. The fishing for herring was largely an autumn activity. Summer brought longer days and the movement of livestock to higher ground. Peat cutting happened in late spring and early summer when the blocks could dry through the long evenings. By late October, the cattle were back on low ground. The peat was stacked. The harvest was in. The nights were long and the fires were kept burning. Tallow candles gave a small light inside the buildings. The buildings themselves were low. The walls were stone on the lower courses and turf above. The roofs were thatched with heather or straw. The floor was beaten earth. Animals and people shared the same structure in the coldest months, the animals at one end behind a low partition. The warmth from the animals was useful. This was not coincidence. The buildings at Largs and at similar settlements all along this coast were designed to make use of it. The body heat of cattle kept indoors helped to keep the temperature above freezing through a hard night. The people slept close together. They wore wool. The blankets were wool. The wool came from their own animals. The sheep kept at Largs in this period were a small, hardy breed. They were not the improved breeds of later centuries. They were light-framed animals, capable of surviving on poor grazing. They were kept for wool and milk as much as for meat. The wool was spun and woven locally. Cloth making was done within the household. It was not a specialized trade at a settlement this size. Cattle were more valuable than sheep. An adult cow was a significant asset. Cattle provided milk, which was made into butter and cheese. They provided hides. They provided traction for ploughing, though the ploughs used on the rig ground here were light. At the end of their useful working life, they provided meat. Nothing was wasted. Bones were used for tools. Fat was rendered for candles and for waterproofing. The woodland remaining along the Gogo water in 1263 was managed. It was not wild forest. The alder and willow along the burn were pollarded or coppiced to produce straight rods. These rods were used for basket making, for hurdles, for the structural elements of thatched roofs. Hazel from the higher valley sides was similarly managed. The coppice cycle was perhaps 7 to 10 years. The stools were old. A generation before, in the 1230s, there was more woodland. Some of the ground above the settlement that by 1263 was rough grazing had still carried scattered oak and birch in that earlier period. The clearance of this ground had happened in living memory for older people at Largs in 1263. The land looked different within a human lifetime. The hill above the settlement was more open than it had been. The view from the shore looking east was a view of bare moorland where there had once been trees. The rivers draining the hills above Largs were small but numerous. As well as the Gogo water, several other burns came down the escarpment and crossed the coastal strip. They were not named prominently in records of this period, but they were present and visible. They drained quickly in dry weather and flooded fast in wet weather. The coastal strip between the escarpment and the shore collected a great deal of water when rain came off the high ground to the east. The Firth itself was tidal throughout this reach. The tidal range on the Firth of Clyde at Largs was significant, perhaps 10 to 12 feet between high and low water on a spring tide. This exposed a wide area of foreshore twice a day. The foreshore below Largs was a useful and regularly visited place. The kelp beds in the shallow water were harvested and spread on the infield ground as fertilizer. This was common practice along this coast. The cutting and carrying of kelp was seasonal work done in summer. Seabirds were part of the landscape in large numbers. Gannets could be seen offshore, diving into the firth for fish. Cormorants sat on the rocks south of the settlement and dried their wings in the thin autumn sun. Curlews moved across the low ground near the burn mouth. Their call was part of the sound of the place in the early morning, before the light came up properly. The light in October at this latitude was already short. By 4 in the afternoon, it was nearly dark. The working day ended with the light. People did not move far from the settlement after dark. The paths between the rigs and the shore were known, but they were rough. There were no bridges over the burns, only fords. In a wet autumn, the fords could run deep. The ground between Largs and the next settlement to the north was rough coastal pasture and occasional outcrops of rock coming down to the water. The settlements along this coast were spaced several miles apart. Between them, the land was largely unenclosed. Cattle could drift along the shore if not watched. In summer, this required attention. By the time of year when the light was failing early and the tides came in cold and grey, the animals were already brought in, and the coastal strip between settlements stood empty under the low sky. The sun drops behind the hills of Arran sometime after the 6th hour of the afternoon. The light goes slowly at first, then all at once. On the eastern shore of the Firth of Clyde, the town of Largs sits in a narrow strip of flat ground between the water and the rising moorland behind it. The hills come down steeply here. There is not much room between the shore and the high ground. The settlement in 1263 is small. A few dozen timber and stone buildings cluster near the shore. There is a church. There is a harbour of sorts, though it is modest. The buildings sit low against the hillside, as if pressed there by the weight of the sky above the water. The firth itself is wide at Largs. On a clear evening, you can see the island of Great Cumbraes close offshore. Arran lies further south and west, its mountains dark against the last of the light. The water in early October is grey and cold. It does not reflect much. The surface moves without stopping. The fishing boats are coming in now. They are small open vessels, clinker-built, with a single sail each. They work the inshore waters for herring and cod. The men who sail them have been out since before first light. They beach the boats on the shingle rather than moor them to any permanent structure. The hulls scrape on the stones. That sound carries in the evening air. The catch today is modest. It has been a difficult season on the Firth. The herring run well in autumn, but the weather has been unsettled and the men have not gone far. They unload the fish quickly. Baskets of wicker and wood are carried up above the tide line. The fish are gutted on flat stones near the water's edge. The smell of it drifts inland on the breeze. The women who work the fish are already there. They have been waiting. They know the time the boats come in the way they know the tide. Some of them are the wives of the fishermen. Others work for the household of the local thane. They split and clean the fish with iron knives, working fast in the fading light. The offal goes back into the water or is left for the gulls. The gulls are already gathering. They are loud in the otherwise quiet evening. Most of the fish will not be eaten tonight. Much of it is set out on wooden racks to dry in the salt air or packed in salt in wooden barrels. Salt is precious here. It comes from the salt pans further along the Clyde estuary. It is not used carelessly. The fish that is salted tonight will last through winter. Some fish is kept back for the evening meal. It will be boiled in an iron pot over a peat fire. The cooking fires in logs are peat fires almost entirely. Wood is scarce on these hillsides. The peat is cut from the moorland above the town in late summer and stacked to dry beside the houses. By October it is ready. It burns low and steady and gives off a dense blue smoke. The smoke from those fires begins to rise now above the roof lines. The houses have no chimneys in the modern sense. Smoke escapes through a hole in the roof or through the gap between the roof and the top of the wall. The interiors fill with a thin haze that never fully clears. Eyes adjust to it over a lifetime. A stranger's cough. The houses themselves are simple. The walls are stone, where stone is plentiful and near to hand, or timber and wattle elsewhere. The roofs are thatched with heather or reed. The floors are beaten earth, sometimes covered with rushes. There is one main room. A hearth sits in the center of it. There are no windows, or only very small ones, and those are unglazed. When the door is shut, the only light is firelight. In the larger households, the fire is built up now for the evening. The Thane's Hall is the biggest building in the settlement. It stands slightly apart from the rest. Its walls are stone, and its roof is steeply pitched. Inside, the central hearth is wide enough to hold several large logs, though again, peat is more common here than wood. Tallow dips and rush lights are lit along the walls. They give a yellow, unsteady light. The hall begins to smell of tallow and smoke and damp wool. The Thane's household eats better than most. There is fish tonight, but also oatmeal porridge made thick in an iron cauldron. There may be some salted meat, pork or mutton from stores put up earlier in the season. There are kale and root vegetables grown in the strips of cultivated ground behind the settlement. Onions are common, leeks too. These go into the pot with whatever else is available. The result is a thick grey stew. It is eaten from wooden bowls with a spoon or the fingers. There are no forks. Bread is baked on flat stones beside the fire. It is made from oat flour, not wheat. Wheat does not grow reliably this far north and west. The oatcakes are thin and unleavened. They come off the stone hot and slightly charred at the edges. They are eaten with everything. The lesser households eat more plainly, a pot of porridge, some dried or fresh fish, perhaps an onion or a handful of kale. The meal is the same most evenings. Variety comes from what the season offers and what can be caught or gathered. Children eat the same food as adults. There is no distinction made. The animals are brought in now for the night. In smaller settlements around logs and in the farmsteads on the slopes behind the town, cattle and sheep are housed in one end of the same long building where the family sleeps. This is practical. The animals give warmth. In October, the nights are cold. The temperature drops quickly after dark. The warmth of a cow matters. The dogs are everywhere. Every household has at least one. They are working dogs, lean and rough-coated. They sleep near the fire. They eat scraps. They bark at strangers and at anything that moves in the dark outside. On the shore, the light is almost gone now. The last of the fishermen have pulled their boats up clear of the tide. The shingle is wet and dark. A few men linger. They check the ropes that secure the boats. They turn the nets over in their hands, looking for tiers that will need mending before morning. The nets are made of hemp. A torn net means a lost day's fishing. The mending is done by hand with a small wooden needle. Out on the Firth, the lights of ships are visible. Tonight, in early October of 1263, those lights are not the lights of ordinary trading vessels. A fleet has gathered in the waters near Largs. It is the fleet of King Hakon of Norway. It has sailed from Bergen in the summer, down through the Northern Isles, around the top of Scotland, and south through the Hebrides. It numbers somewhere between 100 and 200 ships. The exact count varies with every account that survives. The people of Largs know the fleet is there. They have known for days. The ships have been visible from the shore. The longships and supply vessels anchor and move in the grey water of the Firth. They are too far out to see clearly in the failing light, but their presence is felt. It has changed the character of the evenings here in ways that are hard to name exactly. The Norwegian ships carry men who eat their own food and speak their own language. They eat dried fish and hard bread. They drink ale and water stored in barrels. The ships themselves are provisioned for a long voyage. Some of the sailors have been at sea since July. They are tired. The weather in the Firth in late September and early October has been rough. Several ships have already been driven aground on the beach south of the town. Back in the settlement, the conversations in the evening are quiet and close. Men who have worked the boats all day sit near the fire. Their hands are stiff from the cold water and the rope. They rub oil into the skin to soften it. The oil is fish oil rendered from the offal. It smells strongly. Everything smells strongly in these small, sealed rooms. The women of the household talk while they work. There is always work after the meal. Spinning is done in the evening by firelight. The wool comes from the sheep kept on the hillside. It is spun on a drop spindle, a simple tool of weighted wood. The thread produced is coarse but strong. It will be woven into the heavy woolen cloth that everyone here wears. That weaving is done on an upright loom set against the wall of the room. The clothing is practical and heavy. Men and women alike wear a long woolen tunic that falls to the knee or below. Over this, in the cold months, they wear a heavy cloak pinned at the shoulder. The cloak is the most valuable piece of clothing most people own. It serves as a coat by day and a blanket by night. The colors are the natural colors of undyed wool, brown and gray and off-white, with occasional pieces dyed with local plants. Weld gives a yellow. Woad, where it can be obtained, gives a blue, but most people wear undyed cloths. Shoes are made of untanned leather, simple and low, fastened with a leather thong. They are soaked through by midday on any working day near the shore. The feet are cold most of the time from October to April. People accept this. They have always accepted it. Children are put to sleep on straw pallets near the fire. The pallet is covered with a piece of wool or a sheepskin. There is no bed frame. The floor is where most people sleep. In larger households, there may be a wooden sleeping platform raised slightly off the ground, but it is not common in a settlement of this size. The Thane has a proper bed with a woolen mattress and linen sheets. Linen is expensive here. It is imported or traded for. The church in Largs is a simple stone building. It stands near the center of the settlement. By evening, it is locked and dark. The priest has finished the last of the day's offices. In a settlement this size, the priest is the only person who can read. He keeps the records of the parish in Latin. He knows the calendar and the feast days. He tells the people when to plant and when not to work. His authority in daily life is quiet but constant. The light on the water is gone entirely now. The Firth is black. The Norwegian fleet is out there somewhere in the dark. The watchfires on some of the ships are visible as distant points of orange. They do not move much. The night is still, and the anchors are holding. On the hillside above the town, a man tends a small fire of his own. He is watching the ships. He is not a soldier. He is a herdsman who keeps a few cattle on the upper pasture, but he has been asked to watch and to report. The Scottish crown is aware of the situation on the Firth. King Alexander III is not in Largs tonight. He is at Ayr, or near it, with his forces. Word has been passing back and forth along the coast for weeks. The herdsman wraps his cloak tighter. The wind is picking up from the north. The peat fire at his feet throws sparks sideways. He watches the distant lights on the water. He does not know what will happen in the morning. Nobody on shore does. The fleet has been here long enough now that its presence has become ordinary. A new kind of ordinary. One that sits uneasily beside the usual rhythms of fish and fire and sleep. Down in the settlement, the last doors are pulled shut. The last fires are banked for the night, peat laid heavy to keep the heat until morning. The gulls that were loud at the tide line have gone quiet. The only sound now is the water on the shingle and the low. The night settles over Largs on the Firth of Clyde in the autumn of 1263. The last of the daylight has gone from the western water. The sky above the hills to the east holds a deep, dark blue, almost black, and there are no lamps in the streets, because there are no streets, not in the sense we would use that word. There are tracks between buildings, worn into the earth by feet and by animals, and these tracks are now invisible in the dark. The settlement at Largs is small. A cluster of timber buildings sits close to the shore, above the line of the highest tides. There is a church dedicated to Saint Columba, its walls of rough stone, its roof thatched with heather and reed. The church is the largest building most people here have ever entered. The Firth of Clyde is wide at this point. Across the water, the Isle of Arran rises in darkness, its hills a black shape against a sky beginning to show the first stars. The island of Little Cumbraes sits closer, low and flat, just to the southwest. These are familiar shapes to everyone who lives here. They have looked at them every day of their lives. The tide is moving. It moves at all hours, regardless of what the people on shore are doing, and at this time of year, in October, it carries a coldness in it that was not there in July. The water along the shoreline makes a slow, patient sound, pushing over the stones and pulling back. There are larger boulders further along the beach. and around these the water makes a different sound, a lower sound, a kind of hollow knocking when a wave reaches just far enough. The fishing boats are pulled up above the waterline. They are small vessels, open, built from oak planks and sealed with pine pitch. They are heavy things to haul over the stones, and the men who drew them up this evening still feel it in their shoulders. The boats sit with their prows pointing toward the land, their oars shipped inside, their lines coiled and left. A few nets are hung on wooden frames above the shore, still damp, smelling of the sea and of the fish that have passed through them. There are perhaps 40 or 50 people living at Largs itself, perhaps more in the farms and holdings scattered across the low ground between the shore and the hills. The hills begin almost immediately to the east. They are not high hills here, but they are steep enough, covered in heather and rough grass, with outcrops of grey rock breaking the surface. In the dark, they form a continuous wall behind the settlement, blocking whatever wind might come from the east. The wind tonight comes from the southwest. It is steady and cool, carrying the smell of salt water and faintly of wood smoke. The fires inside the buildings were banked down some time ago, not extinguished entirely, because a fire never goes entirely out in a house where people live, but reduced to a glow, covered with a flat stone or a piece of turf to slow the burning. The smoke comes through the holes left in the roof for this purpose, and in the dark you can sometimes see it, a pale drift catching what little light remains. The buildings are simple. The walls are timber frames filled in with wattle-woven branches plastered with a mix of clay and animal dung, dried hard. The roofs are pitched steeply and thatched. The floors are bare earth, beaten flat over years of use, covered in places with dried rushes. The rushes on the floor of most houses have not been changed recently. They hold the smell of the last several weeks of cooking and sleeping and living. People sleep together for warmth. A family of 4 or 5 will sleep in a single room, on pallets of straw laid on the floor, covered with wool blankets woven on a loom that sits in the corner of the same room. The loom is not working now. It will not work until daylight returns, because there is no lamp bright enough to weave by safely. A rushlight might serve for some tasks, but weaving requires clear sight, and rushlights are small and dim, and they drip. A rushlight is made by pulling the green outer skin from a bulrush stem, leaving the soft white pith inside, and then drawing the pith slowly through rendered animal fat. The fat sets around the pith, and when you set it upright in a holder and light the end, it burns for perhaps 20 or 30 minutes. A family in Largs in 1263 might use 2 or 3 of these in an evening if they have tasks that require light. Most do not bother tonight. They have gone to sleep with the dark. The cattle are inside for the night. This is common practice in October. They are kept in a small enclosure attached to the main building, a low extension of the same roof, divided from the living space by a timber partition. The warmth of the cattle passes through the partition and into the room where the family sleeps. This is not an accident. It is a deliberate arrangement, understood and valued. The cattle shift and settle throughout the night, and you can hear the soft sound of their weight moving on the straw. There is a dog outside one of the buildings, a medium-sized grey dog lying against the wall where the thatch comes lowest and blocks the wind. The dog is not asleep. It is watching the darkness toward the shore. Dogs in 1263 are working animals. They guard, they herd, they hunt. This one is a guard dog, and it is doing its work even now, lying still, its nose reading everything the wind brings in from the water. The wind brings something unusual tonight. It has been bringing it for several days. Out on the Firth of Clyde, beyond the low shape of little Cumbraes, there is a fleet. It has been anchored there since the middle of October, and it is a large fleet, larger than anything that has ever been seen on this part of the coast. The fleet belongs to Hakon of Norway. His ships came down from the north, around the top of Scotland, through the waters of the Minch, and down the western coast. There are said to be more than 100 ships in the fleet, longships and supply vessels, carrying several thousand men. The people of Largs know the fleet is there. They have seen it. Everyone along this coast has seen it. The Norse ships have a distinctive shape, low and long, with high prows. During the daylight hours, you can see the fleet from the shore, and it is an extraordinary sight, so many masts in one place that from a distance they look almost like a forest standing in the water. At night there are fires on some of the ships, and these are visible from the shore as small, distant points of orange light scattered across the dark surface of the Firth. The presence of the fleet is the reason that not everyone in Largs is asleep. In a building set slightly apart from the others, closer to the water, 2 men are awake. They are wrapped in thick wool cloaks, and they are sitting near a fire that is not quite banked, still burning low, giving enough light to see each other's faces. These men are not lords, not nobles, not soldiers in any formal sense. They are local men who have been asked to keep watch through the night and to raise the alarm if the Norse ships send boats toward the shore. They have been doing this for several nights. They are tired. They do not speak much. There is not much to say that has not already been said. One of them stands occasionally and goes to the door and looks out toward the water. He can see the lights on the distant ships. He can see nothing else. He comes back inside. He sits down. The fire settles. The dispute between Norway and Scotland over the Western Isles has been moving toward this moment for many years. The Western Isles, the Hebrides, and also Kintyre and other lands to the west, have been under Norse influence or direct Norse control since the 9th century, when Norse settlers came and stayed. But the kings of Scotland have been pressing their claim to these territories for generations. The situation reached a point where both sides understood that something would have to be decided, and so Hakon IV sailed south from Bergen in the summer of 1263 with his fleet to demonstrate that Norway would not yield these territories without consequence. The fleet passed through the Orkney Islands, which were Norwegian territory. It gathered additional ships and men at Kerrera, near Oban, earlier in the autumn. It moved south through the islands, and various local lords made their submissions or their negotiations with Hakon as the fleet passed. Now the fleet sits in the Firth of Clyde, and the autumn is advancing, and the weather is changing, and decisions need to be made. On shore at Largs, none of this high political calculation is visible. What is visible is the fleet, and what is audible on a quiet night with the wind in the right direction is a faint sound from the water, a low and complex sound, the creak of timber and rope, the movement of so many vessels together, perhaps the occasional shout carried across the water and then lost. The two men on watch hear this sound. It is familiar to them now after several nights. They no longer find it alarming in itself. It is only alarming in what it represents. The church of St. Columba stands silent in the dark. Its door is closed. The interior is dark and cold. The stone altar at the east end holds a small wooden cross. There are no candles burning. The priest, an older man who came to Largs from somewhere further south along the coast, is asleep in the small separate building behind the church. His roof leaks in one corner, and when it rains, which it has done several times in the past week, he moves his pallet to avoid the drip. The farms to the east of the settlement, up against the base of the hills, are quieter even than the shore. The fields have been worked through the summer and into early autumn. The oats were harvested in September. They are stored now in a low stone structure close to the farmhouse, threshed and bagged, the smell of cut straw still sharp around the doorway. The stubble in the field has been left standing. Some of it was grazed by the cattle before they were brought inside for the night. Further up the hillside, above the cultivated land, the heather is dry and pale. In the darkness, you cannot see the colors, which are muted this late in the year in any case, the purple largely gone, the heather settling toward a grey-brown. The path up the hill from the farmhouse is a narrow thing, made by sheep and by the feet of the people who go up the hill to cut peat in summer. The peat stacks are beside the farmhouses, built in careful courses to let the air through, covered on top with the flattest pieces to keep the rain from undoing the drying. The smell of peat smoke is the underlying smell of this place, the smell you would notice first if you arrived here from somewhere else, from a town where oak or coal was burned. Peat burns slowly and coolly compared to wood, and it gives off a thick, distinctive smoke that settles into everything: the wool of the blankets, the thatch of the roof, the hair and skin of the people who sleep inside. It is not an unpleasant smell. It is simply the smell of home in this place, in this year. The children are all asleep. The youngest ones have been asleep since shortly after dark fell, perhaps 2 or 3 hours past. The older children, those of 8 or 9 or 10 who help with real work during the day, stayed awake a little longer, but they too are sleeping now. The work they do is physical work, carrying water, feeding animals, gathering fuel, helping with whatever task needs an extra pair of hands, and physical work done from first light until dark makes sleep come easily and quickly. The stars are fully visible now overhead. The cloud that was present earlier in the evening has moved north, and the sky above the Firth of Clyde is clear. The Milky Way crosses from south to north, a pale smear of light. The people of Largs know this sky as well as they know the hills and the water. They have no telescope, no written star charts, but they know which stars rise where and in what season, and they know what a clear sky in October means for the weather that